How is it?
I don't know if there's not at this point.
Okay, fair enough. Is anyone still able to monitor your comments?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, okay, welcome to April's meeting for Editors BC. Before we get started with our presentation, Editing Around the World, I have a few announcements to make. Forgive me for reading it off my phone. I was hoping to have this printed out, but it didn't work out that way, so I have to read it from my phone. So the first announcement that I'd like to make is the National Executive Committee for Editors Canada has an announcement, and it goes like this. Have you been thinking about getting more involved in Editors Canada at the national level? The nominations process is now underway for the National Executive Council and several committee chair roles. So the National Executive Council, there are 9 spots coming up on the 2019 National Executive. It is a 2-year commitment and involves travel to 3 or 4 weekends, weekend meetings a year. Why would you want to get involved? Well, some of the reasons are to help chart the future of Editors Canada in a changing world. Meet and work with colleagues from across the country on key issues and matters to members. Enhance your CV as you develop new skills that you can use in your own work. Gain experience, confidence, mentor other people and be mentored. Learn more about the National Association and how it works. So many of our hardworking committee chairs are returning next year, but there are still some important roles to fill. Awards, if you want to help shine a light on editorial excellence, editing heroes, and talented students. As chair of this committee, you oversee the Tom Fairley Award, the Karen Burak Award, sorry if I mispronounced the name, and the Claudette Upton Scholarship process. There's also a position coming up for foundational skills testing. If you want to help Editors Canada offer entry-level skills testing to members and non-members. As chair of this committee, you can have a real impact on editors' careers as they seek to have their skills assessed through this program, which is just getting off the ground. And then there is also a position coming up in members' services. So if you want to help Editors Canada attract and retain members, this position as chair of this committee, you will help ensure that members have the services and benefits that they need and want. So if you are interested in putting your name in for any of these positions, you can contact Anne-Louise Mahoney at pastpresident@editors.ca, and the deadline is April 26th, so it's coming up next week. Also, on another note, our executive have elections coming up next month on May 15th. Join us if you're interested. There are some positions coming up, and if you'd like to be a part of it, certainly put your name in the hat. Before we start with the presentation, we do have one member here who has served on the National Executive Committee. And if any of you are interested, I was going to ask Peter to share Peter, to share maybe some, highlights of what it's like to be a part of the National Executive for Editors Canada.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the benefits and things that I got out of it. Probably the most important was that if you're on the national executive, you meet editors from right across the country, and you find out the most significant thing for me was that editing is quite different in different locations. Toronto is very much centered on book publishing. Ottawa is almost very much into government editing, which is what I did. Living in smaller communities or larger communities, books and so on. So the experience you get from just meeting these people and finding out about editing really broadens your horizons about the editing across the country, but also gives you ideas about the kind of editing you might want to do, or if you have time to meet people who are in medical editing, just different things that you haven't thought of. And so it's a really broadening kind of experience. Let's see. That's kind of the biggest one as far as I'm concerned.
Are there any, aside from time, investing your time, are there any other things that members might want to know? Is it something that that they have to plan for? Is it flexible?
It's not any more energy drawing than, say, being a member of the local executive. It's kind of similar in a way.
Same time.
Same time. I know now because traveling, one of the attractions was traveling across the country. And they do, that's still there, but they do it less now and do a lot more through telephone meetings. And I have no experience of that. A couple of people that I encourage was quite as happy about that. David Harris left us. He really disliked it. And worked pretty hard to get him with this secretary and so on. Something else that I think is really important is the way the national organization is structured. There are table members, and then there is a representative east and a representative west. And I don't think that works very well. For example, when I was president here, the member at large west, or whatever she was really interested in Calgary and Edmonton, but not interested in BC.
So just having some purpose.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that we have people just anywhere on the executive representing our branch, or at least who come from our branch. And that helps ensure that our points of view get made, and it also helps that there's a lot of information from national that doesn't come back very well. And so it means there's someone who knows what's going on, and someone who can talk. Yeah, and at various times, we did this in Ottawa. People would at our program, we would get up and talk for 5 minutes about, well, these are the things we discussed at the last meeting. And that was really, really useful. It was really good. So, back to meeting other editors, one of the things that I experienced was I got to meet some of the best editors in Canada. People that I really admire and so on. I mean, we've got Francis Peck here, and well, I knew Francis sort of through EAC. But you meet a lot of people who are really, really good editors, Montreal, Toronto, and so on. That's really important. Yeah, Rosemary Shipton became a really good friend of mine. She's kind of the key of editing, maybe retired.
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah, okay?
Thank you, yeah, thank you very much for sharing. As I mentioned, you can see me after you'd like to contact, or you can go onto Editors Canada website. And again, just one more time, please join us next month for our executive election here for the BC chapter of Editors Canada, Editors BC. So now we will be turning our focus to the main presentation of the evening by Ellen Michelle. She is a fellow executive member for Editors BC. Her current role is as professional development chair. Co-chair. I share the role. Sorry, to your co-chair. And she will be talking to us tonight about editing in another world. So without further hesitation, I'm going to introduce Ellen.
Hi everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ellen, and as mentioned, I am on the executive committee this season as professional co-chair. And I specialize in editing science fiction and fantasy primarily. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I've been specializing in these genres for about 3-4 years now. And yeah, so I'll just dive right in. So a little bit about me to start. I am this semester just finishing up my Master of Publishing degree at Simon Fraser University. I also did the editing certificate program there a couple years ago. And in November of last year, I launched my own publishing company called Constellate Publishing. I publish short fiction digitally within these speculative fiction genres that we're going to be talking about today. And I also run a book review blog, which is currently being rebranded into Dwarf Star Reviews, and I will relaunch in a couple of weeks. So that's kind of the, in a nutshell, what I do. Freelance is my full-time though, and that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. We'll go over some genre definitions so we really know what exactly we're talking about. And then the nuts and bolts of these genres, which are world building and your characters and your beings that are introduced in these stories, in these novels. And then some tools and basic guidelines for you as an editor to use and follow while you're working with these genres. And then some resources as well. I'd like to say, if you have anything to add or any questions at any time, please feel free to raise your hand throughout. I'm happy to answer those as we go along. Sorry. No, that's fine. So this will be just kind of a brief overview of editing these genres because we don't have too much time together today. So I could go into way more detail about any of these things. So if you do have questions, please feel free. And we do have someone monitoring the chat on the live stream. So if anyone joining us from afar has questions as well. That's okay, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Just checking. Yes. So.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I think you can see it better.
Yeah,
That's
that's
fine.
fine.
Keep talking.
Alright, so diving in with these genre definitions. So speculative fiction is the term probably most widely used, and it is the kind of all-encompassing genre definition. So it includes science fiction, fantasy, crime, mystery, and horror. And that specific definition of speculative fiction can vary depending who you're talking to, but that's kind of the most widely accepted definition. Going in more specifically, science fiction is known and accepted to be kind of the literature of ideas. So it deals with a lot of advanced tech, AI, and space travel, and time travel, and all those kind of traditional sci-fi kind of things. And then we have fantasy, which is more about the myth and the folklore. There's a lot of world building that goes into fantasy. And this is where you would have a lot of humanoid beings in your stories. So elves, dwarves, orcs, hobbits, those kind of things are usually seen in fantasy. And a lot of people put science fiction and fantasy in those two kind of separate boxes, but you also have science fantasy, which combines them, and a lot more of the traditional SF stories are actually science fantasy. They are a combination of these two genres. So, what exactly is SF? So we have speculative fiction, we have science fiction, we have science fantasy. They all kind of fall under SF. And SF is the common shorthand for all of these genres. So I like to think of SF as being speculative fiction, so kind of encompassing all of those genres. So that's how I'm approaching it today. So, world building. Why build a new world? Why not just write your story on Earth as we know it today? World building is a really good creative activity, and building a comprehensive world really adds to the coherence and substance of a story. So here's a quote from Stephen Gillick that I really like. So part of the SF writer's job is to introduce the background without disrupting the narrative flow, and indeed by enhancing it if possible. So the world building is not just meant to be in the background. It needs to be in the background, but you need to have all of these details sorted out. So as an author, you would need to have so much more of your world built than actually makes it into the manuscript. And doing it that way, it can't make a bad story good, because you really need to have the story there, but it can make a fair story good, and it can make a good story great by having that world building and that consistency within the world building. And that's where editing comes into it. So you need to watch for, consistency is going to be a huge word that I use a lot today, because that is really the editor's job coming into it. It's the author's job to build the world and to have that background in place, and it's the editor's job to make sure that it is there consistently and that it makes sense and that it's believable. So some things that go into world building. So these are things that you have to, as an editor, watch out for as you're going through a manuscript. A lot of manuscripts in these genres are really, really long. Most of the manuscripts I work with are anywhere between 120,000 words to over 200,000 words. I have one coming up that is almost 300,000 words. So these stories and these series can get really, really long. So it's important to have kind of guides to follow. So things with time markers, because an author is creating this world, the time in this world might not work the same way that it works on Earth. And that could be anywhere between how many hours per day, how many seasons there are, how those seasons work, your year systems, are you using the AD and BC, or are you creating your own system that has its roots in the history of your own universe and your own world. Even things like holidays and days of the week can all differ. And a lot of this comes from because the yes. So here's an example of a calendar that one of my clients gave me to use as reference while I was working on his series. So it's a little bit blurry, but you'll see that there are 6 days a week instead of 7. There's still 12 months, but there are only 3 seasons. And one of those seasons happens twice a year at different times. So this was something completely different than what we're used to on Earth. So as I was going through his manuscript, and in this story, the timing and the seasons played an important role in the story itself. So it was really important for me to have this as a reference as I was going through his manuscript so that I could always compare. A lot of his chapters had timestamps, or date stamps at least, at the beginning of every chapter to kind of remind the reader what season it is and what was going on, because it did jump around a little bit. So having this as a kind of guideline as I was going along was really important for making sure I was watching for that consistency, making sure that those seasons were happening in the correct months. Things like that. So calendars are getting into maps and geography. So it's generally understood that the laws of nature on Earth apply elsewhere in our universe, and we like to, it's commonly accepted that those laws of nature will also apply to fictional universes. And that largely comes from the fact that most authors are from Earth. I'm not going to say all. Most authors you're working with are probably from Earth and have a basic understanding of the laws of nature here as we know it. If they're writing hard science fiction, then they probably really understand the laws of nature in our known universe. So it's generally accepted that even in fictional universes, these laws of nature will also apply. So you would need to be watching for things like mountains, bodies of water, valleys, plant life. All of those things will react in really similar ways. Things like what kind of air humans can breathe. That's generally accepted even on other planets. If their gas system is not the same as on Earth, then you have to wear an oxygen helmet. Things like that can come up and can be missed because maybe it's not overtly mentioned that they're wearing a gas mask and then suddenly they're eating something. Well, it's not really plausible or believable because they need to be breathing in proper oxygen. So these kind of things can sneak up and be missed by the author because they know their world and they can just picture their characters doing these things, but if it's not explained properly, then it's not believable to the reader, and that can take the reader out of the story. So as an editor, it's your job to point out these inconsistencies. The same goes for physics, things like gravity and weather and proportion. And I'll get back to proportion a little bit later when we talk about characters and beings, so that's really important. So all of these things, there will be a system of gravity, there will be anything you can think of that is like the laws of nature in our own universe. You will need to see some sort of representation of that in the fictional world. And that applies whether you are on one planet, or if the story is set on several planets, or if the story is set on several planets and a space station, or maybe just on a spaceship. There's so many different ways that these genres can play out. There's so many different settings, but they all need to have some sort of explanation and believability to them. So some of these things will need to be explained. And now after I've told you that you all need to follow the rules, you can absolutely bend the rules. It is common in these genres for these rules to be bent, but they cannot be bent arbitrarily. And this is where an editor comes into play a little bit, because some authors can get a little bit carried away about what rules they're bending. If they are bending rules or breaking rules entirely, they need to be, is there a question? Okay, sorry.
No, but I did figure out how to say the question.
Oh, good. That's important. Yeah, so if they are bending these rules or breaking the rules entirely, it can't be arbitrary. There has to be a purpose for it. There has to be a reason for it. And the bending or breaking of these rules can really drive the story forward, and that's perfectly acceptable, but there has to be an explanation for it. There has to be a how and a why for these things. And that's just so the reader doesn't get thrown completely out of the story. So if you are bending the rules, or if your author is bending the rules, you can't just jar your reader out of these rules. You have to explain why. And it doesn't need to be a, this is how this happened. Like, it can be a little bit more subtle than that. But as an editor, you need to be watching out for places where a reader might be taken out of the story because of some rules being broken. I have an example I'd like to share about that. So I showed you the calendar before in that same story. There is a fictional world that has been created, and like, the entire story is set in a fictional world. But within this fictional world, there is another world that has been created that not everyone has access to, and it has been created through magical powers. And we don't need to get too much detail about that, but this world was created by magic and it exists. And seemingly randomly, this magic shifts and things start disappearing and reappearing. So an entire species of animal on this planet can suddenly disappear. There can be a giant lake that suddenly appears one day that has fish swimming in it that the locals have never seen before. Even some people can suddenly disappear. And they call it, they have a word for it, that every time this happens, and they watch out for it, and then every time that this happens, you have to go run around and find all your loved ones, make sure they still exist. And that's bending and breaking a lot of rules of the laws of nature, because lakes don't just magically appear. But this magic system is explained in little bits and pieces all throughout the story, and then you have the big reveal at the end, and then everything makes sense. And it's foreshadowing up to all these little changes, and all these things disappearing and appearing suddenly. They all lead up to the big reveal at the end, and then the reader is satisfied. They might be thrown a little bit like, oh wait, how did that happen? But not so much that they're taken out of the story, but more that they're being pulled into it because there's intrigue. So there's a fine balance that you need to follow. So follow the rules and explain them when you're
We did
broken.
get a comment that sounds amazing.
All right, well, the book isn't published yet, but when it is, that will pick up some readers already. Wonderful. Thank you for that comment. All right, so now we will move into humanoid characters. And for the purposes of this discussion, I am talking about human-like beings. I am excluding humans because it is fairly safe to assume that humans appearing in fiction will be humans as you and I understand humans to be. So I'm talking more about humanoid creatures like elves, dwarves, hobbits, anything that kind of looks and acts human-like, but isn't actually quite human. Okay, we'll get to that. So why would you want to use humanoids? Why not just use humans? There are a few different reasons, and I mean, creativity is a perfectly valid reason to use humanoid creatures or beings. And a lot of fantasy makes use of this. A lot of science fiction has aliens and things that just make the story more interesting. But the reason can be a little bit deeper than that. A lot of SF authors will make social and political commentary in their works, and using humanoids allows them to kind of take a step back from that direct commentary, because if they do make that direct commentary that they want to make, they risk having negative reactions to their books could be banned, there are myriad of other reasons why humanoids are a better fit for those sorts of things. I'm going to pull up another point here. So it's by Stanley Schmidt. And I have the books that all these quotes come from at the end, so I recommend those. But he says, if you create a believable alien society, and by aliens, his book is specifically aliens and alien societies, but this works for other humanoid creatures as well. If you create a believable alien society in which parallel problems arise naturally, a reader might think about them from a new perspective, and then recognize how his thoughts might apply to his own society's problems. So a lot of SF can be used to make that sort of social and political commentary without making it directly. For various reasons. One thing to keep in mind as we're talking about humanoids is their relation to humans. And are they the same species as humans and just a different race? Or are they an entirely different species on their own? And the distinction between these might seem obvious, might not seem obvious, I'm not sure. I fell down quite the research rabbit hole when I was looking into this because I had my own opinions going into it, but I really wanted to see what the general consensus was with this topic. And there's quite a debate going on, so here are the main questions that came up when I was looking into this question. So are they humanoid or are they non-humanoid? For the sake of this, we will assume that they are humanoid, so elves, dwarves, hobbits. Can they successfully reproduce? And that means a cross reproduction between a human and the humanoid being. Because that, if they can successfully reproduce, that's a sign of them being the same species but a different race. And are the half beings fertile is another one. So if they can successfully reproduce, but the product of that reproduction cannot then further reproduce, then there's a question of if they are the same species or not. And the last point here, do they have similar social structures? This one is not quite as, it's not taken into consideration as much as some of the other ones because even across different cultures and humans, as we know them, there are a lot of different social structures. But that is one of the questions that has come up regarding species or race. So what is generally accepted? Well, everyone goes back to Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, because he was instrumental in a lot of early fantasy. So a lot of people just kind of go with what Tolkien says, which is that they are the same species and that it's a different, that each one is a different race of the human species. And another thing that you can consider as well is the history of the author's universe, because how these beings have descended and where they descended from can play a large part in this. And that also leads into why it's important to make these distinctions, because a lot of, especially high fantasy, so stories like Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of myth, there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of religious aspects in there as well that are really important to make these distinctions. So, and in a lot of stories, I've had quite a few where these creatures or beings do come up. They are a large part of the story, but this distinction isn't necessarily important. So it really depends on what you're working with and how much of the history before the story is set your author has created. But if there is a distinction, then that needs to be made clear, it needs to be consistent, and there needs to be backup explanation for it. So yes, knowing the difference. And a lot of this will come from, if you're an avid science fiction fantasy reader, a lot of these things you'll just know, because there has been common threads throughout fantasy series that have made these distinctions known, so a lot of people aren't aware. But if you find yourself editing a manuscript that has one of these beings in it and you aren't quite sure, then research is really important, because avid fantasy readers will notice if there are errors, if you have dwarves and hobbits, but suddenly they're being used interchangeably because they're so not interchangeable. They're both short, but they have a lot of differences aside from their height. And Elephant Holiday, Elephant, you know, one should be pretty self-explanatory. One is really short and one is really tall, generally. That's a really good sign. One is red, green, and the other usually doesn't. But things like this top one, the Undying Mermaid, it might not be as commonly known. There aren't as many stories that feature Undying Mermaids. So there's also the note to know when these definitions are flexible. Because as with a lot of the world building, there are rules, there are laws of nature, but you can bend them, and you can break them, and you can make them fit your story, or your author's story, as long as there is explanation in the how and the why. Things like Undying Mermaid. Has anyone heard of an Undying before? Okay, a couple people. What about mermaids? How many of you know what a mermaid is? Everybody? If you dig a little bit and do a little research, you'll see that a mermaid is actually a type of Undying. But mermaids are used more commonly, and from my rabbit hole research, I figured out that mermaids became more popular because of the Little Mermaid. That rolls off the tongue a little bit better. So then that ended up being the commonly used term. So if they can and have been used interchangeably, but you need to know when that's okay to use and when it's not okay, because again, consistency. I was working on a manuscript recently that did not use the word mermaid at all. They were Undines, and there were specific reasons for that, because there is a bit of a difference. So I had to make sure that terminology was being used exclusively and consistently. Pronouns. So with humanoid beings, there can be a lot of flexibility with pronoun use, especially now that the singular they is becoming more and more common and acceptable, which is great. That's a really good go-to to use for your humanoid beings, because some of them won't have gender. It is not necessarily necessary that all of your beings have a male and a female. And again, that can be really up to the author, and it's your job as editor to make sure that these things are being used consistently. So in traditional demonology, when I was studying it in undergrad about 6 or 7 years ago, before the singular they really came into common conversation, angels and demons and those types of beings were referred to as it. They did not have gender, so they were not a he, they were not a she. It was an it. They might be transitioning into using a singular they now, depending, but a lot of traditional demonology comes from medieval times, so it was commonly used then. And it is a perfectly valid option as well for you, or your author, if that's what they decide to use for pronouns for these fictional beings that they have created. So it is an option, they is an option, and custom pronouns are also an option, which I find a lot of fun. So I did a sample edit recently for someone who has their humans have a third gender. So they have he and him, they have she and her, and they have me and them as a third gender. And I think that's really exciting. I really hope I get that one, because I want to work with that and see how they've managed to weave that in. Because it's not just about pronouns and how they're being referred to, it's also about reproduction and other gender concerns there. So if they have 3 genders that are commonly accepted, it's just the way the world is, there are 3 genders. Which 2 can reproduce? Do you need all 3 to reproduce? Can one not reproduce and the other 2 reproduce? There are a few different ways that you can go. And again, consistency and believability are key here. be consistent, make sure your author is being consistent, and make sure that everything surrounding these concepts is believable to the reader, because you don't want to jar your reader out. So I mentioned proportion earlier when I mentioned physics, so we're going to get into that a little bit more now. I've been working on a series with an author client for the past couple of years now, and the main characters in this series are giants, and they are giant humans. They look very much like you or I, except they are 20 feet tall. Compared to the average human in this world that is 6 feet tall. So I was coming across a lot of references where humans and giants were in the same scene together, and they were fighting, or they were trading goods, or things like that, where they are interacting, and there's a lot of references to size comparison. So I did a little Googling, and I found a height comparison. Where you just type in the height and it pops up with this little graphic here, and I have the reference for that at the end. So this is a 20-foot giant next to a 6-foot human. So the human only comes up to about the giant's knees. And can you imagine what that would be terrifying? Across a 20-foot tall giant, my goodness.
For those of us that are shorter than 6 feet.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a 6-foot tall human. Most of us are under 6 feet. They have the average human male in this world is 6 feet. So that's the comparison that I've used. So, and this was actually really, really useful for me, having this visual beside me as I was working on these scenes, because it's not just about the height, right? So the height is one thing, knowing how tall I come up next to a giant. But there was one scene in particular that I worked on for longer than I would like to admit, trying to figure out. Math is not my strong suit, and I had to do a little bit of math here. But there was one scene where a giant and a human were in conflict. There was about to be a fight going on. I would definitely place my money on one of those to win this fight. So conflict is about to ensue, and the giant and the human trips and falls down, and the giant goes to step on the human, which is a really good tactic for the giant, I would say. But in this scene, the author described the giant's foot as being the size of a man's torso. So this giant was going to step on this human, but his foot was only as big as the man's torso. And now I'm looking at this and thinking, that seems really small, right? And so I tried to do a little bit of awkward math, figuring out, how big my foot is compared to my height, and figuring out how big this giant's foot needs to be. And I think I have it figured out. It's a little bit small, but it's close, might be acceptable depending on the giant. Maybe this giant has small feet. I don't know. But I wasn't 100% sure, and I wanted to be 100% sure. So I asked for some advice from some editors who are better at math and science than I am. I'm really thankful that those people exist. So I brought them this scene, this example, and I asked them for their help, and they said, well, math kind of works out if it was just a straight, 6-foot tall person growing to being 20 feet tall. But there's more to it than that. The physics of the body, and I'm not going to attempt to go into detail on that because, again, it's not my strong suit, but I asked for help when I needed it, and they gave it to me. And they explained that because of the, assuming that the gravity was similar to that of Earth and all of these other considerations, that yes, technically those were close to the right proportions, but the giant would fall over with those size feet. They would need much larger feet in comparison to their body size than a human's feet to their height, because they have a lot more mass to them. So my author had done his calculations, and he probably compared his feet to his height and figured it out, but something still felt off, and it was. The giant's feet needed to be much, much larger than the man's torso. So I flagged that, and he fixed it in the next round, and all is well. But these are things that you need to keep in mind, because you don't run into this in your everyday life. At least I haven't run into a 20-foot tall giant in my everyday life. If one of you have, I want to talk to you after, because that's cool. Terrifying, but cool. So you can see how complicated that can get when you're dealing with a 6-foot tall human and a 20-foot tall giant. Well, what if you also have other beings to consider? So this series doesn't just have giants and humans, they also have dwarves and gnomes and a whole other list of different types of beings that need to be compared to each other. So suddenly it's not just comparing a 6-foot tall human to a 20-foot tall giant, but it's also comparing the dwarf to the giant and the dwarf to the human and every which way that can go. So if in one scene the gnome is compared to the human and saying, okay, well he's about at his knees, but then the gnome is compared to being up at the shoulder height of the dwarf, well that would mean that the gnome is actually at like wrist height of the human. So there are some inconsistencies there, that it's not just between the two characters or two humanoids that you're currently dealing with. You also have to think about how that relates to the other characters and if that's already been compared, and how tall they actually are and what their size actually is in relation to each other, which can get really, really confusing, and I highly recommend using visual aids. I like to have 2 monitors when I'm editing. I have the manuscript along with my general style sheet on one, and then I have my visual aids, my calendars and things on the other screen, because I'm constantly referring back to these resources. So, series is a lot of fun to work on, by the way. Very confusing at times, but a lot of fun. So, as I've said multiple times over and over again and drilling into your brains, consistency is key. And consistency is key in a few different ways. We talked about pronoun usage, we talked about species and race determination, and those are really important to keep straight. But this can get even further confused when you have characters that can change form. So think of werewolves, or undines can actually transfer between their human state and their mermaid state. So this can get confused even more when you have to think about the appearance of a character in one form compared to their appearance in another form after they've changed and transferred. And there's one specific example that came up recently. So this is a common symbol that is used throughout the world of a manuscript that I was working on recently. And this symbol was tattooed on a young girl's ankle. And that's all fine, normal, she has a tattoo, and it's symbolizing her her membership of a certain, let's say, organization, for sake of simplicity. But I reread that scene a couple of times, and something felt off, and after a while I realized that, well, she has a tattoo on her ankle. How does that appear in her mermaid form when she doesn't have feet or legs? She has one tail. How does this tattoo show up on her tail? Where does it show up on her tail? Because you don't really have an ankle on your tail. Or does it not show up at all? And this is something that the author had to then consider, because this character is changing forms. And this tattoo is a really important part of that character's story. So it has to be mentioned, it has to be explained when she transforms, where does that tattoo go? And there are a couple of other things that you can consider that are similar to this, things like birthmarks, any other kind of I'm gonna say abnormality, but that sounds like it has negative connotations to it. But anything like a tattoo or a birthmark, or even eye and hair color needs to be considered. So if you have a werewolf character who has red hair in their human state, well, they're probably going to have red hair in their werewolf state. Okay, simple enough. But what if they have dyed red hair? What color is their fur when they're a werewolf? Is it their natural color, or is it the color of their dyed hair? I haven't actually come across this yet, but I would really like to see how an author deals with it. Because these sort of things need to be considered. Does the dye transfer when you change form? I don't know, you have a lot more hair when you're a werewolf than when you're a human.
Actually, Jim Butcher did that statement, I think his 12th or the 11th, when he was working with the, did he not? He had those werewolves that were working.
I can't recall, because I did you
And there was that red-haired girl, and that turned.
She never heard that part.
I think it was a consideration of the color of her hair. In that particular moment, it was a really cool scene. I'm trying to remember though, it was a dye, but he did a big deal of, different color werewolves.
He's great.
He did, yeah. So it's just like, I
And you can think of that with any sort of marketing, right? Like look at the Harry Potter universe. I can't remember the term for it right now, but the people who can change into animals, like Professor McGonagall. Do you remember what the term is?
Transfiguration.
No, animagus.
Animagus, thank you, that's the one I was looking for. Animagus. There are markings so that when they change into their animal form, they can tell that they are actually an animagus. They're not actually a cat or a dog or whatever animal they've chosen to turn into. Peter Pettigrew has no finger. So things like that need to be kept in consideration with changing form and consistency within that. So where does the tattoo go? That's for the author to decide. But if you as an editor are reading through and you notice that there could be an inconsistency, you need to flag that and make sure the author considers it, because they might not have. Custom languages. I'm going to show you one of my favorite cartoons. This always makes me laugh. Tolkien teaches intro to fiction. What's the first thing an author must do when beginning their novel? Develop characters? Nah, that's not necessary. You must always first construct an elf language from scratch. And some authors will do this. Some will borrow from Tolkien. Some will create their own language from scratch. Maybe not elf. Maybe it's some other being. Yeah.
Borrowing, is that considered borderline or full-on plagiarism?
There's some debate within the fantasy community about that, because a lot of fantasy genre has come from Tolkien, so they don't really consider it borrowing or plagiarizing from Tolkien. They consider it to be kind of in canon for fantasy. But there is a lot of debate around that, because some of that can be like just plagiarism, which is obviously bad. I'm not doing that in any way, shape, or form.
Like they make a T-shirt and they make the money out of it and invent it, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, that's a really good question. Yeah, and some argue that it is fantasy canon, and that these things are just how these beings talk. And
so do they have like an actual fantasy kind of dictionary for that? Sorry, I'm not that versed.
Yeah, it's totally fine. Well, I do have a resource listed on one of my last slides here. That is a Tolkien dictionary that goes through how all of these beings and landmarks and things work within the Tolkien universe. And that is strictly like within Lord of the Rings and its other works. So a lot of people will take that as just how elves are, just how dwarves are. And since I just said elves and dwarves, I was reminded of a thing that I didn't actually put in here, which is the spelling of elves and dwarves. Because elves were always elf and elves with an F and a V, but dwarf was in the English language kind of before the fantasy dwarves came about, and was spelled dwarfs with an F. But when Tolkien wrote his series, he made it dwarves with a V, and some say that that is to make consistency with the elves, and then dwarves. But dwarfs, FS, also exists in our language because that word is used for other applications as well. So, fun side note. Which has to do with languages, that's fine. So some authors will create their own elf language or other language, and some will grow up with Tolkien. Whether that's allowed or not, we will debate another time. And as an editor, one thing you need to keep in mind is when is it appropriate to use the custom language, and when should it be translated into English or whatever language this novel is being published in, but for sake of simplicity, I'll choose English. So there are going to be cases where it is applicable and it is better to use the custom language. Because there can be instances where you have 3 characters in a room, 2 characters are speaking one language, and the 3rd character is meant to not understand that conversation. So it can be good to use this custom language in those instances, and then you can either have one of those characters translate for the 3rd person, or you can have a translation that appears in the narrative, although that is less commonly used. And if you're just using short clips of this language, you can kind of rely on the reader a little bit to understand what's going on from context. And that can actually be really important in foreshadowing, because certain phrases or certain words could be used and reused in specific contexts, and that could, for a variety of reasons, become more important later, and you might need to rely on the reader later to have understood the custom language later on when it was explained earlier. If that makes sense. That was a lot of jumping around. So as an editor, again, you need to kind of help the author determine when it is applicable and when it is better to use the custom language versus using English. And that might end up being a discussion. When I run into this, I usually flag all instances of the custom language as I go along, and then I see how that language progresses through the rest of the work. If it becomes really important later, then I know that there are certain things that we can do earlier on to make sure the reader understands and make sure there are those kinds of foreshadowing. But if it doesn't become important later and it's just kind of something they added because they felt like it, then we're adding in more of the translations. And a lot of that ends up being a discussion with the author afterwards, after I've worked through the entire work. So I was flagged as I go, highlighting in a specific color so I can scroll through quickly and find those references again. So I'm going to very quickly, very briefly go into non-humanoid beings. We are running out of time a little bit, so I'll just go through this a little bit quickly. There are so many different types of non-humanoid beings that your author can bring into these stories, so I'm not going to list them. That would be ridiculous and exhausting. So instead, I'm just going to go over very briefly a generalization of what terminology can or should be used in specific genres. And this is a very general overview. There's a lot of leeway within this, and a lot of variances that can take place depending on the type of being, depending on the type of world or universe and your author. But very quickly, in science fiction, you're usually, like in strict science fiction, space kind of stuff, you're usually working with aliens. Think of the movie Aliens. That's a really good example. Where they are aliens in the sense that we can generally understand. Then you have the science fiction subgenre of space opera, which is more like Star Wars, where they can be aliens or animals or some sort of combination thereof. Some of them will be humanoid, some of them will be not humanoid, some of them will be walking around in 2 legs but otherwise not humanoid. There's a lot of gray area there in terms of what terminology you're using, so again, consistency is key. Fantasy, you're usually going to be working with a lot of humanoid beings, elves, dwarves, hobbits, those types of beings. So anything non-humanoid would likely be animals. You might have some aliens, depending, especially if you are crossing over into science fantasy. But you're probably looking at more animals. Think in Harry Potter, you have the magical creatures class that Hagrid teaches. You have hippogriffs and those horse things that draw, that draw the carriages that you can only see if you've seen death. Thank you. You know your Harry Potter trivia. I like it. So those would be considered animals within the world. And then you have urban fantasy, which is again going to be a lot of animals because urban fantasy is set in a modern kind of urban setting. But you can also have a lot of supernatural or paranormal beings come into play in urban fantasy as well. So again, consistency and believability are key there. So I'm going to go into kind of the tools and basic ideas. Are there any questions so far? I've been kind of going really.
Yeah. Quick one. So you keep talking about explanation. Maybe as long as something is explained, it's good. But then we, as editors, we also advise authors to show and tell. So how do you strike a balance between that kind of word thing? How do you go, okay, don't tell me what it means, show me, but then it's a world that nobody knows anything about. How do you?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And in science fiction, I would say the kind of cop-out for that is to have a scientist character who really likes to talk about their field because they can explain things as they're going on. I read a book, gosh, I guess like 2 years ago now, but it's coming to mind as an example, where AI was a really, really big thing in this world. It was a science fiction story, not science fantasy, but AI was really important, and they were kind of crossing lines with how AI is understood in our general understanding. And their main character was a doctor who worked on humans who were being genetically modified with different AI kind of things being put into their body. So that character was able to explain a lot of the things that were, a lot of the rules that were being bent and broken, because it was their job to explain these things to other characters. So they were able to do that and it made sense in the setting, and it made sense in the story, and it helped push the story forward. But it was also explaining to the reader how that world worked and how her field of medicine in this world worked with the AI. So things like that are really useful. Obviously, you don't want to insert unnecessary characters, so there is a fine line there, but I would say try to tell your author to try to explain it within the dialogue, explain it within the storyline. So
if you're the one, as an editor you lost, that's when you flag it.
Yeah, absolutely. If I'm being drawn out of the story because something doesn't make sense, I'll flag that. And whenever I return a manuscript to an author, I write a really long email or letter, whatever you want to call it, that kind of goes over those big picture things that were confusing or inconsistent, so I'll bring the idea up there, and then I usually have a conversation with them about how they can fix it without doing a major rewrite. Because usually a major rewrite isn't necessary, they just need to add in bits and pieces here and there to make it flow a little bit better and make it more consistent. But yeah, having a scientist character can be really, really key for that kind of thing. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So some tools and basic guidelines that you as an editor can use. Style sheets. Style sheets are obviously really important when you're editing anything. But when you're editing speculative fiction genres, it's not just about if you use the Oxford comma or not, or if you prefer semicolons or end dashes or those kinds of style choices. So this is plural for a reason, because I don't have just one style sheet per book or per series. I also include a character sheet. This is really important, especially for high fantasy and space opera science fiction, where you have a lot of characters. That series I mentioned I was working on with the Giants, I actually have the character sheet for that series separated into type of being. So I have my list of giants, and then I have my list of humans, and I have my list of dwarves, and so on, to make sure that that's all kept straight, and to make sure the dwarves stay dwarves, and the giants stay giants. They're not supposed to. It's not going to happen to them, that's so it's confusing. Maps are really key. I like to, especially with, like again, that giant series, it takes place over a really, really large area of this one world. And you have one main character going this way and one main character going this way, and you're kind of going back and forth between the two main characters until they eventually meet later on. So having the map along with me there was really key, making sure that they actually were 4 days distance apart on the map when it says that they're 4 days distance apart. And magic systems, so that one that I mentioned where things were randomly disappearing and reappearing, the magic system in that world has some characters were born with this innate magical ability, and there were 5 or 6 different types that they could be born with. They're all associated with a different color and a different stone, so I had a chart to help me with that to make sure that color was always associated with that magical ability and so on. So that's really important. You have complex magic systems. Calendars, which I already showed you an example of one, can be really important if you, especially if you're working on multiple different planets or a space station with a couple different planets, because time is going to work a little bit differently on all of those. So it's important to have your calendar straight and how time works between characters. Glossary, especially if you are dealing with a lot of obscure planet names or holiday names or even character names sometimes. A glossary definitely comes in handy. And some authors in these genres will actually include the glossary in the published book as well to help readers along. So if the readers get it, you should also get it to help you edit and make sure things are being consistent. And generally anything else the author has. Whenever I'm working with a new client, I always ask them for any notes that they're willing to share with me, even if it's just a 100-page Word document of random notes. If they will give it to me, I will use it. Find is a really good tool in Word to help me pick out and make use of that 100-page document. I wish I could say that didn't happen to me, but it did. And it make you sad.
Something that comes to mind for me, as we were going through this list, do you also actively at this point participate in the illustration process and editing that to making sure that that is matching the story?
That's a really good question.
All of these items to be somewhat like, because you're picturing it when you're reading it.
So you're saying if the final published book will include illustrations?
And do you also do your editing kind of input on the illustrations to kind of marry?
Yeah, in my freelance capacity, I haven't done, with the series about giants, the author has an artist friend that has done some drawings and some character drawings, and he sent them to me, just kind of for general feedback, so a little bit. I'm not sure if he plans on including this in the published book, but I think he's publishing them on his website. So they are related to the series and are public facing, so, but that isn't like as I'm going. That was after the fact, and that's only because I've been working with this one client on this series for 2 years now, so I've worked with 2 novels and I think 2 short stories within the universe already. So he just likes asking for my opinion on these sorts of things, which is good.
You
Yeah.
probably formed an image in your mind of these characters as you were editing.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why I can't give input on those. But in my capacity as a publisher for the short fiction zine that I publish, I do that all the time because every story is published with cover art and additional illustrations. So I always ask the artists because it's, the author sends me a story and I edit it, and then I commission an artist, so I send them the story and they need to get illustrations based on the story. So in that capacity, I'll always ask the artist to send me drafts first to make sure that it is close to the story, and if I think there are some inconsistencies or something wrong, then I'll send the draft to the author and kind of play intermediary there and have a conversation to make sure that it is accurate, because I want my author to be happy with the art that is representing their story, and I don't want the artist to have to make changes after they've finalized it. So I do usually ask for drafts at that stage. Can I answer your question?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I think it was kind of like, it just kind of seemed to be something that
Absolutely, and
would play well together.
if the author already has illustrations and character drawings made, that can absolutely be included in your style sheet, because then as you're going along and you see, oh, they have brown hair, oh, but in this drawing they have red hair, so which is correct, and I would just correct that. So literally anything else the author has can be useful for editing these genres. I have used random documents that the author's like, I really don't think this will help you, and it can help, so. Is that a question? No? Okay.
Just down on my face.
So custom dictionary, if you aren't aware, in Microsoft Word, you can create a custom dictionary, and then when you get the little red squiggly lines, you can right click, and instead of hitting ignore, you can hit add, and that will add that word to your custom dictionary. So this is really, really useful, especially when you're working on series, because I'll have a custom dictionary for each series that I'm working on. So when I edit book 1 in the series, I'm creating this dictionary as I go, and then a year later when I'm working on book 2, those character names, those planet names, they're already loaded in that dictionary, so I just need to click on use this dictionary for book 1, and that's all automatically loaded in. This is really important too, because I have run into cases with I was working on a space opera series. It was 10 novels, and a couple of the novels had so many red squiggly lines that Word actually stopped tracking them. It gave me a little pop-up notification. There are too many errors in this document, so it wasn't going to track it anymore. And they weren't errors. They were just weird spelling names and planet names and things like that that were consistently used and used correctly, but Word flagged them as being wrong because it wasn't a word that Word recognized. But as soon as I loaded in my dictionary from a previous book in that series, then it started tracking actual errors again, because everything, all the names that I thought were wrong were now correct. So that's really, really key. All right, so additional resources, as I mentioned. So world building, I quoted from this at some point. This one was from like 1995, I think. It's a little bit old. And there are probably newer resources as well, but I have this one handy. And it is a really neat guide it says a writer's guide, but anything like that is really useful for editors too, because you'll know what the writer is thinking. Then a similar one for the aliens and alien societies. Again, I think that one's from 1996 or something similar. And then the Dictionary of Tolkien, which I also mentioned, that one I use a lot. And Reddit is actually a really good source of information because you have a lot of hardcore fans of these genres using Reddit. So when I said I fell down a research rabbit hole in the whole species versus race thing, it was on Reddit. I was going through threads and threads to see what the fans were saying, to see what the writers and the avid readers are saying about these issues. And then this is the site that I used for the height comparisons, and that's where those images came from. But you can just Google height comparison, and it was the first one that popped up. So, yeah. Yeah, Amy.
I was going to ask this earlier, because you mentioned it way back, but it wasn't terribly relevant to these things. But you mentioned hard science fiction. What?
Yes. Hard science fiction is a genre of science fiction, and that would be more science fact than science fiction. It is a fictional story, but they use hard science. Those stories tend to be very science driven. There's a lot of science explanation in it. There's a lot of like, I want to say expose, that's not the right word. But there's a lot of like, this is how the science works kind of paragraphs that aren't necessarily driving the story forward in a traditional science fiction story would. So there's a lot more of that science research going into it. Hard science fiction is written by a lot of scientists because they like to use the knowledge that they've gained. Yeah, so it's a subgenre of science fiction. Yeah, I have a
I have a question about, we were talking about sci-fi and fantasy are often used to social commentary. And, you know, we see that a lot in Star Trek, for instance, when they make comments, or, you know, LGBT communities in other worlds and stuff like that. And it's, first, I think for Star Trek, there's much more of a sort of progressive element. Wondering if you've ever run into the opposite, where people, let's say, have social commentary, but in a very disturbing way, like, you know, rape fantasies or incel communities, or that kind of that aspect of it, where if they made it into a human story, it would be really, really appropriate. It would absolutely flag it for various problems, and you know, we as editors are supposed to flag things where you know there might be gender bias or whatever. But if you have a fantasy story where the author could say there's like plausible deniability because it's a fantasy world, have you run into that? How do you respond to that?
Thankfully, I haven't run into that yet with any of my client work. And I will say that I haven't read or watched Game of Thrones, but I know that that's a common example used for that sort of thing. If anyone else who has read or seen it wants to comment.
I had a client that was supposed to be writing movies and had a lot of food. My friend said some things that were following some so you may have realized. It was like, really want to check your
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that I would flag, and how I flag it, I think, would depend on maybe how explicit it is, if it seemed intentional or not, and communication that I already had with the author. Because I always try and have quite a few emails back and forth before I start working, or even commit to working with an author, so that I can make sure, that we will work well together. Have a certain rapport. So I would kind of take all those things into consideration into how I would flag it, but it would definitely be something that I would flag, or suggest even a sensitivity reader, or something like Yeah, but thankfully I haven't come across that yet. I'm sure I will at some point, but yeah. Thanks. Any other questions?
Well,
Alright, I think we are out of time.
well, we still have some time to thank you for this very interesting and informative presentation. I truly enjoyed it, and I'm sure the rest of the group did too.
And you can feel free to email me if any other questions do come up later on.
Well, it definitely, I learned a lot too. So thank you so much, Ellen, for taking the time to do that. So as Ellen mentioned, if you have any questions, her contact information is up on the screen. Or I guess you can look at our webpage, Editors BC, and we've also got the contact information too. But it's her chair position.
Yeah. Which is that email's shared with my co-chair, so go with this email address if you have questions.
Also, if you have any questions about next month's meeting, you can visit our webpage, Editors. It's a page attached to Editors Canada's site, so Editors BC, and feel free to contact us. I hope to see you next month on May 15th. Do you have any questions?
What's the live stream, looking at that? I didn't know
It is on our website. There's a link that every month's announcement contains, but you have to be able to, you have to be a member to be able to log in and see the YouTube. So, thank you. But yeah,
We got several thank yous from our live streamers.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us from afar.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Yes, we have a professional development seminar coming up on April 27th, I believe, the Saturday, which is editing cookbooks with Lana Okerlund, who is awesome. She's come to talk to us many times before she is a member. And that will be on editing cookbooks, which I'm super excited for. And I will be there, so I hope to see you there as well. If you're going, yay!
You get to actually go and try.
Oh my god, I wish.
Something.
I wish that would be even more enticing. No, but you learn how to edit a cookbook properly. So yeah, there is. Yes, thank you for that reminder, Amy.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm sure you did as much as I did. And I thank you once again, Ellen. Thanks.
And thank you, live streamers, for showing up.
And have a great long weekend, everybody.
I was like,
That's right.
Yeah.